My name is Linda. I donated a kidney 3 years ago, completely anonymous. My mother sold my story to a tabloid without my consent. The article ran with my photo, my surgical scar, my full name. That night, the stranger who received my kidney recognized me, drove 4 hours, and knocked on my family's front door. I opened it to find a man I'd never met, holding the magazine, tears streaming down his face, and speaking the words I never expected to hear. My name is Linda. I donated a kidney 3 years ago, completely anonymous. My mother sold my story to a tabloid without my consent. The article ran with my photo, my surgical scar, my full name. That night, the stranger who received my kidney recognized me, drove 4 hours, and knocked on my family's front door. I opened it to find a man I'd never met, holding the magazine, tears streaming down his face, and speaking the words I never expected to hear. But before I can tell you what he said, you need to understand how a living organ donor becomes front-page news. It starts with a scar, a small, fatting line low on your abdomen. You think it's private, a mark of something you did quietly. Then someone you trust sells access to that scar, and suddenly a million strangers know the shape of your sacrifice. My mother saw a payday. I saw the end of my anonymity. And when that man arrived that night, I realized the story I'd lived wasn't the one that had been printed. The real one was far more dangerous. 3 years ago, I made a choice that would connect me to a stranger forever. I just didn't know that the connection would cost me everything. 3 years ago, I was 27 years old, working as a high school biology teacher in a small town outside Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I had a 2-bedroom apartment that smelled like coffee and chalk dust, a rescue cat named Mabel who judged everyone from the top of the refrigerator, and a mother who believed that every life event, no matter how private, was a potential revenue stream. Her name is Darlene, and Darlene had spent my entire childhood turning family tragedies into gossip currency. When my father left us when I was 12, she sold her side of the divorce story to a local newspaper for $300. When my grandmother died of kidney failure 3 years later, my mother used the funeral as an opportunity to launch a GoFundMe for expenses she never actually paid. Grief for Darlene was simply a narrative with a dollar sign attached. I learned early that if something mattered deeply to me, I needed to protect it from her. So when I decided to donate a kidney to a stranger, I didn't tell her, not at first. The idea planted itself in my head during my first year of teaching. One of my students, a 16-year-old named Javier, was on dialysis. He missed school 3 days a week, sat in the back of my classroom with an exhaustion that had nothing to do with teenage laziness, and still managed to be the kindest kid in the room. I started researching living donation. I learned that a healthy person can live a full, normal life with one kidney, that the remaining kidney compensates and grows larger, that the risk of surgical complications sits around 5 to 10%, and that the long-term life expectancy of donors matches the general population. I learned about non-directed donation, the kind where you give to a stranger on the national waiting list, completely anonymous. The thought lodged in my chest and wouldn't leave. I was healthy, I had good insurance through the school district, and I had watched my grandmother die slowly because no compatible donor was available. Somewhere out there, someone was dying the same way right now, and I had something that could save them. I contacted the transplant center at the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center without telling anyone. The evaluation process took 6 months. Blood tests, urine tests, CT scans, chest x-rays, EKGs, psychological evaluations, meetings with social workers, nephrologists, surgeons, a transplant coordinator named Maureen who became my anchor through the entire thing. They screened me for any possible reason I might not be suitable, and they screened me for motivation. They wanted to know I wasn't being coerced, that I wasn't expecting financial compensation, which is illegal anyway under the National Organ Transplant Act, and that I wasn't doing this for fame or some misguided idea of becoming enmeshed in the recipient's life. I told them the truth. I wanted to help someone, and I wanted to do it quietly. Maureen explained the anonymity protocols in detail. The recipient would not receive identifying information about me. I would receive minimal, non-identifying information about them. All communication, if any, would be filtered through the transplant center. Even if we both wanted to meet, it would be a carefully coordinated process months or years after the surgery, and only if both parties consented. Nothing could be shared publicly without explicit written agreement. I signed every form. I understood the walls protecting my privacy, and I believed they were solid. My mother found out anyway. I had to list an emergency contact, and I made the mistake of writing her name. The hospital called her by accident, a clerical error, a nurse who dialed the wrong number from my file. Within an hour, Darlene was on my doorstep. She didn't ask if I was okay. She didn't ask why I was doing this. Her first words were, "Do you know how much money people make from these kinds of stories?" I told her this wasn't a story. It was a private medical decision. She smiled the way she always smiles when she's already making plans. "Of course, sweetheart, I just think you're being naive about what you're giving up." I made it clear that under no circumstances was she to speak to anyone about this. She nodded, promised, hugged me, and I believed her because I wanted to believe my mother could respect one boundary in her life. That was my mistake. The surgery took place on a Tuesday in early March. The recipient was a 43-year-old man. That was all I was told. No name, no location, no occupation. The team removed my left kidney through a laparoscopic incision about 3 inches long, low on my abdomen, just above the waistline. The scar healed into a thin, pale line, barely visible unless you knew where to look. Recovery was harder than I expected. The first week was brutal. Pain, fatigue, the strange sensation of my body recalibrating to function with one kidney. My mother came by twice, bringing casseroles I didn't want and questions I didn't answer. She kept staring at me like I was a lottery ticket she hadn't figured out how to cash yet. I told Maureen about my concerns. She made a note in my file, no unauthorized disclosures. The privacy walls held. For 2 years, my life went on. I went back to teaching. Mabel continued her silent judgment. Javier graduated with honors and is now in college, healthy and off dialysis, not because of my kidney, but because of a donor he never got to thank. The scar on my abdomen faded from red to white, a small private artifact of the bravest thing I had ever done. I didn't talk about it. My colleagues didn't know. My students didn't know. I lived quietly with the knowledge that somewhere out there, a stranger was alive because of me, and that was enough, more than enough. But Darlene hadn't forgotten. She'd been waiting, circling, looking for an angle, and 6 months ago she found one. A tabloid magazine called Real Life Weekly, the kind that pays cash for sensational human interest stories with exclusive photos, the kind that doesn't ask too many questions about consent. My mother called their tip line and pitched them the story of her heroic daughter, the anonymous kidney donor with the quiet life and the fatting scar. She had photos of me from a family barbecue, one where I was wearing a bikini top and the scar was just barely visible if you looked closely. She had details about my recovery, my job, my town. She gave them everything. The tabloid paid her $12,000 for the exclusive, and she signed the contract without telling me, without asking me, without the transplant center's consent. She didn't just sell a story. She sold my privacy, my safety, my anonymity. She sold the one thing I had protected my entire life. I found out on a Wednesday afternoon during my lunch break. A colleague, another teacher named Susan, walked into the faculty lounge with a magazine in her hand and a strange expression on her face. "Linda, did you know about this?" She held it up. The cover was a glossy photo of me in the bikini top, that barbecue photo, blown up with a circle around the small scar. The headline screamed, "My daughter gave away her kidney and never told me WHY." My full name was printed beneath the image. The article inside included the name of my hospital, details of my surgery, a fabricated quote from my mother about my secret struggles, and a direct invitation for the anonymous recipient to come forward. "If you received a kidney from Linda in March 2 years ago, we want to hear your story." I stared at the page until the words blurred. My hands started shaking. I dropped the magazine on the table, grabbed my phone, and called my mother. She answered on the second ring, chipper like she'd been waiting. "Now, honey, before you get upset, just think about the exposure. This could open doors for you." I couldn't speak. I hung up. The bell rang. I had to walk into a classroom and teach 14-year-olds about osmosis while everything I'd built my privacy around crumbled in my chest. The rest of the day passed in a fog. I drove home, locked the door, and sat on my couch with Mabel in my lap, waiting for the fallout I was terrified was coming. I didn't have to wait long. That night at 11:30, the doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I saw a man I had never seen before in my life, holding a copy of Real Life Weekly, his face wet with tears. And I knew before I even opened the door that the walls I trusted had been shattered completely. I opened the door. The man standing on my porch was maybe 6 feet tall, early 40s, wearing a windbreaker and jeans that looked like he'd thrown them on in the dark. His hair was unwashed, his eyes swollen. He held the magazine up in one hand like a shield, and the other hand was shaking. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then he said, "I'm the one you gave your kidney to. My name is Ben, and I need you to understand something before you hate me for showing up like this." His voice cracked. That article just destroyed my life. I let him inside, not because I wasn't afraid I was, but because the fear in his eyes was worse than my own. He sat on my couch, Mabel vanished into the bedroom, and he told me everything. 3 years ago, Ben was dying. Polycystic kidney disease, the same thing that took his own father at 41. He was on dialysis 12 hours a week, watching his energy drain away, trying to hold on to enough strength to be a dad to his 7-year-old daughter, Maya. The transplant saved him. He got the call on a rainy morning, was prepped and wheeled into surgery, and woke up with a new kidney, no name attached, no face, just a simple card from the transplant center saying a non-directed donor in Pennsylvania had given him this chance. He wrote a thank you letter through the official channels. He never expected to meet me. He never expected to know my name. He rebuilt his life quietly, a carpentry business in Western Maryland, weekdays building cabinets, weekends with Maya at the park. He was happy, anonymous, safe. Until the article, Real Life Weekly didn't just print my name and my photo. They printed the date of my surgery, the name of the hospital, details about the recovery timeline that could only have come from my mother because she was the only family member who visited me during those weeks. It was enough. Ben's ex-wife, a woman named Angela who had been fighting a bitter custody battle for 2 years, saw the article at a grocery store checkout. She recognized the date, the city, the scar description I'd apparently given in the supposed interview that my mother fabricated. She put it together in an afternoon. Within 48 hours, her lawyer filed an emergency motion claiming Ben was medically unstable, that he had concealed a life-threatening condition from the court, that his decision to accept an organ from an anonymous stranger demonstrated reckless judgment and put Maya at risk. She asked for sole custody. The hearing was scheduled for next week. Ben showed me the legal papers on his phone, hands trembling so hard he nearly dropped it. The article was Exhibit A. I sat there in my living room at midnight, staring at those documents, and I felt the floor of my world crack open. I had donated a kidney to save a life. I had followed every privacy protocol, signed every form, believed with my whole heart that the walls around this gift were solid. My mother had sold the story for $12,000, and in doing so, she hadn't just exposed me, she had weaponized my act of love against the very person it was meant to help. She had taken the purest decision I ever made and turned it into ammunition in a custody fight she didn't even know existed. But here's the thing she did know. I didn't find that out until the next morning when I called her, still shaking, still sitting in the same spot on the couch where Ben had wept. Darlene answered like nothing was wrong, like her daughter's life wasn't splashed across supermarket racks up and down the East Coast. Linda, honey, I've been meaning to call. The magazine wants a follow-up. They're offering another $5,000 if you'll sit for photos with the scar visible. I asked her if she knew that the recipient had been identified. Silence, then a small, tight laugh. Well, that's good for the story, isn't it? The mysterious reunion angle, we can call them back, and I hung up. I called Ben and told him I would do whatever it took to fix this. That afternoon, I drove to the transplant center and met with Maureen, the coordinator who had walked me through the entire donation process. She was pale, angry in the way that only professionals who have watched a system they trust get violated can be. The hospital's legal team was already involved. The article had triggered an internal investigation because it contained details that should never have been public: surgical specifics, facility names, the exact schedule of my post-operative visits. Someone had leaked information, either from my medical file or from a staff member's loose conversation. My mother couldn't have known those details unless someone inside gave them to her. Maureen said the hospital was considering legal action against the magazine and was filing a complaint with the Department of Health and Human Services for a potential HIPAA breach, even though HIPAA technically applies to covered entities, not family members. They were exploring every option. She also told me something that made my blood run cold. My mother had contacted the transplant center 2 weeks before the article came out, posing as a journalist, asking for verification of the donor timeline. She'd used a fake name, but they traced the call back to her cell number. She'd been building the story for months, mining details, feeding the tabloid piece by piece, and she'd never once asked my permission. But the worst part, the part that made me realize I had never truly known my mother at all, came that evening when I received a voicemail from a blocked number. It was Angela, Ben's ex-wife. Her voice was syrupy, performative, the same tone Darlene used when she was about to twist something innocent into something ugly. Linda, I just want you to know I don't blame you personally. This must be very hard, but I have a daughter to protect and I'll do whatever it takes. I hope you'll understand when the time comes. She didn't say what time meant. I called Ben immediately. He was terrified. Angela's lawyer had subpoenaed my medical records from the transplant center, arguing that since the article had made the donation a matter of public record, my privacy was waived. The hospital was fighting it, but the court had fast-tracked the request. A decision would come in 2 days. If they got those records, they could twist any complication, any note, any detail into proof that Ben's judgment was impaired, that he'd aligned himself with an unstable donor, that he was unfit. I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, Mabel purring against my side as if she knew I was coming apart. I replayed every moment of the last 3 years. The quiet pride I felt every time I caught a glimpse of the scar, the anonymous letters I'd exchanged with Ben through the transplant center's screening process, letters I later learned my mother had stolen, copied during one of her visits. The way I'd believed the good I'd done was inviolable. My mother had reached into the most sacred part of my life and sold it for grocery money. But the stakes now were not embarrassment or lost privacy. They were a little girl who might lose her father because of a lie I never told. And I realized as the gray morning light crept through the blinds that the only way to stop this was to do something I had spent 27 years avoiding. I had to face my mother in public under oath and destroy the narrative she'd been selling my entire life. The next day, my lawyer, a sharp woman named Elaine I'd found through the school's legal assistance program, gave me the news. Angela's custody hearing had been moved up. The judge wanted to hear testimony about the article's origins and whether the disclosure was intentional. I was being subpoenaed as a witness. And Darlene, my mother, was listed as a key informant for the opposing side. She had already given a sworn affidavit claiming that I had enthusiastically participated in the article, that I'd posed for the photos willingly, that the whole thing was a joint venture to raise awareness for organ donation. All lies, all neatly typed, signed, and notarized. Elaine told me that if we didn't counter this, if we didn't prove that my mother acted alone and without consent, Ben could lose custody permanently, and I could face legal consequences for a story I never authorized. I called my mother one last time. I asked her to retract her affidavit to tell the truth. She laughed. Sweetheart, you always were dramatic. This isn't about you. This is about my book deal. A publisher reached out yesterday. They want the whole story from my perspective. The mother who gave everything for her daughter's journey. It's going to be a bestseller. Then she hung up. And I knew, standing in my kitchen with the phone still warm in my hand, that I was about to walk into a courtroom and do something I had never done before. Treat my mother as the adversary she had always been. But as I turned to leave, my phone buzzed again, a message from an unknown number, one line. If you testify against me, I'll tell the press you took money for the interview. I have a paper trail, think about it. And attached was a forged bank transfer, $3,000 made to look like a payment from the magazine to my account. She had been planning this from the start. She had set me up to take the fall, and suddenly the truth I was fighting to expose might not be enough to save any of us. The message sat on my phone like a live grenade. $3,000 deposited into an account I'd never seen, with a memo line that read interview fee real life weekly. My mother had built a paper trail that made me look like a co-conspirator, and she'd done it before I even knew the article existed. I called Elaine immediately. She was silent for a long moment, then said, "This changes things. If we can't prove the transfer was forged, you're not just a witness anymore. You're a defendant in a potential fraud case." The custody hearing was in 3 days. I spent those 3 days combing through every bank statement, every email, every possible thread that could expose Darlene's fabrication. Elaine hired a forensic accountant who traced the transfer to a shell account registered under my mother's name in Delaware. The evidence was there, but it would take weeks to fully certify. The hearing wouldn't wait. The courtroom was small, wood-paneled, with that particular smell of old paper and floor wax. Ben sat at the defendant's table with his attorney, a tired-looking man named Greg who had been doing family law for 20 years and had never seen a case like this. Angela sat across the aisle, immaculate, composed, a binder of exhibits in front of her that I knew included the magazine article, the forged transfer, and her affidavit detailing how Ben's secret transplant made him an unfit father. Maya was not in the room. She was at her grandmother's house, unaware that a stranger's kidney and a tabloid headline were deciding which home she would live in. Darlene took the stand first. My mother wore a navy blazer and a string of pearls that I recognized as the ones she'd stolen from my grandmother's jewelry box after the funeral. She swore the oath with her hand flat on the Bible, looked the judge in the eye, and delivered the performance of her life. She described how I had allegedly confided in her about wanting to go public, how we had discussed the photo, the scar, the angle, about the mysterious recipient. She claimed I had signed a consent form for the interview. She produced that form, a single page with my signature at the bottom. I stared at it from my seat and I felt the floor tilt. The signature was a near-perfect forgery. I had never signed that document in my life. Elaine whispered, "We can contest the signature. Handwriting analysis will take time." But we didn't have time. Angela's attorney asked Darlene about the bank transfer. My mother tilted her head, a practiced gesture of maternal concern, and said, "Linda told me the magazine paid her directly. I thought it was a little seed money for the book we were planning together. I never imagined she'd deny it now." She said it with such gentle disappointment that I saw the judge's expression soften, and I wanted to scream. Then it was my turn. I walked to the stand on legs that didn't feel like my own. I raised my right hand. I told the truth. I told them about my quiet donation, the 6-month evaluation, the confidentiality forms, the joy of knowing I'd helped a stranger. I told them that I never consented to the article, that I had begged my mother to stay silent, that the first time I saw the magazine was in the faculty lounge with a room full of colleagues staring at my scar. I told them about the forged bank account, the shell company, the years of my mother treating family tragedy as a product. And I told them about the night Ben showed up at my door, holding the magazine and crying, a man I'd never met but whose life I had saved. By the end, I was crying too, but I didn't look away. Angela's attorney cross-examined me hard. He showed the bank statement. He showed the signed consent form. He asked if I had ever given my mother permission to share my medical details in any context, and I had to answer yes, in the context of family updates, never a tabloid. He twisted it until the sheer innocent fact of answering my mother's questions about my recovery sounded like complicity. I walked back to my seat feeling like I'd been hollowed out. But then the "it gets worse" moment arrived. Mid-afternoon, the bailiff brought in a surprise witness, the editor-in-chief of Real Life Weekly, a man named Stuart Vance, who had been subpoenaed by Elaine the day before and had flown in from New York. Vance was a gaunt man in an expensive suit who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. He testified under oath that the magazine had paid Darlene $12,000 for the exclusive, that they had never spoken to me directly, that all communication went through Darlene, and that the so-called interview quotes were completely fabricated. He also admitted something that made the courtroom go silent. Darlene had provided internal hospital records to back up the story, my post-operative schedule, the names of medications I'd been prescribed, the date of my first follow-up visit. The magazine had paid an additional $5,000 to an anonymous source who Darlene claimed worked at the transplant center. That source, Vance said, was a nurse named Colleen. He produced her name only after Elaine threatened to have him held in contempt. Colleen Bray, who had been my discharge nurse 3 years ago, the person who had sat with me during the hardest night of my recovery and told me I was brave. I remembered Colleen's face, her kindness, the way she'd held my hand when I couldn't reach the call button. I remembered her asking questions about my family, about whether anyone would support me after surgery. I had told her about my mother, my fears. She had nodded sympathetically, and then she had sold that information to a tabloid through my mother's contact. Darlene had found her, groomed her, paid her to mine my medical file for details that should have been behind steel. The betrayal wasn't just from my mother, it radiated outward through every system I'd trusted. Greg Ben's attorney stood up and asked the judge to admit the editor's testimony as evidence of a pattern of fraud. Angela's attorney objected, but the judge overruled. The air in the room shifted. The narrative that Angela had built was being dismantled in real time, not by Ben's defense, but by the truth about my mother's scheme. The judge called a recess after Colleen's name was dropped, ordering the hospital to provide all records of communication between Darlene and any staff member. The court would reconvene the next day. That night, I sat in my car in the parking lot of a diner, unable to go home. Ben called me. He was still terrified, but his voice had a thin thread of hope. "Whatever happens tomorrow, I need you to know that meeting you was the best thing that ever happened to me. Even with all this, I don't regret it." I told him I didn't either. Then I called Elaine. She had already filed a motion for an emergency protective order freezing Darlene's assets and had contacted the district attorney's office about potential criminal charges for forgery, fraud, and HIPAA violations. She also said something that stopped my breath. "Linda, your mother had an entire relationship with Colleen that predates the donation by months. Colleen wasn't just a one-time leak. She was part of your mother's planning from the moment you told her about the surgery." My mother had been strategizing before I ever went under the knife. The next morning, the hospital's internal investigation delivered its preliminary findings to the court. Colleen Bray had accessed my medical records 17 times after my discharge, each time without a clinical reason. She had sent screenshots to Darlene in exchange for payments totaling nearly $8,000 over 2 years. The hospital's legal counsel testified that Colleen had been terminated and was under criminal investigation. They also provided a sworn statement that no consent for media disclosure was ever on file. The forged consent form my mother produced had the hospital's logo, but it was a template anyone could download from their website. The forgery was amateurish, but in the chaos of a custody hearing, it had nearly worked. The judge, a woman named Judge Crawford with graying hair and an expression that had seen everything, called both parties to the bench. She dismissed Angela's motion with prejudice, which meant Angela could not refile. She cited the fraudulent evidence, the tainted witness, and the fact that Ben had done nothing wrong except receive an organ from a kind stranger. She also issued a bench warrant for Darlene's arrest on charges of perjury and fraud right there in the courtroom. My mother stood up from her seat, face pale, mouth open, as two bailiffs approached. She looked at me, and for the first time in my life, I saw genuine fear in her eyes, not the performative kind she used for sympathy. She said my name once, a question I didn't answer. She was let out in handcuffs, and the sound of the door closing behind her was the most final sound I've ever heard. Ben collapsed into a hug with his attorney, tears streaming. Angela stormed out without a word. Maya would be staying with her father. But as the courtroom emptied, I noticed a figure sitting in the back row who hadn't been there before. A woman in scrubs, her name badge visible from where I stood. It was Maureen. She walked toward me, her face a mixture of relief and sorrow. She handed me a letter from the transplant center, an official apology for the breach, and a promise that they were rebuilding their privacy protocols from the ground up. She also said something that planted a new knot in my chest. Darlene wasn't just selling your story. She was planning to sell your contact information to other recipients on the waiting list. She had a list. Colleen gave her access to a support group's private directory. My mother had been building a contact book, a mailing list of vulnerable people she could exploit. The book she bragged about was never just a memoir, it was a database. I drove home that afternoon numb. Mabel met me at the door. The silence of my apartment felt different now, not safe, just empty. The scar on my abdomen itched, a phantom reminder that the most generous thing I'd ever done had been used as a weapon by the person who was supposed to protect me. But the truth had held, the walls had crumbled, but not on the innocent. My mother's architecture of lies had collapsed under its own weight, and for the first time, she would face consequences. Ben sent me a photo of Maya laughing on a swing set with a caption, "Because of you." I looked at that photo for a long time, and I understood that some gifts, even when exploited, can't be undone. The kidney still worked, the father was still a father, the child still had her dad. But the story didn't end there, because when the police searched Darlene's apartment after her arrest, they found something I never expected. A second file, thicker than the one on me, with a different name, a different scar, a different donor. My mother hadn't just sold my story, she had found another living donor, someone I'd never met, and she was already pitching their story to a different tabloid when the handcuffs clicked. I was not her only victim. And the person in that file was about to walk into my life and change everything. The police called me 3 days after my mother's arrest. They'd found the second file in a locked drawer in her apartment alongside the forged consent forms, a burner phone, and a notebook filled with names and contact information for transplant recipients across 6 states. The file had a name on it, Grace Okonkwo, 28 years old, a living kidney donor from Maryland who had given to a stranger the same year I did. My mother had already inked a deal with a rival tabloid, a publication called Inside Story Weekly, for $15,000 if Grace's information panned out. She was 1 week away from publication when the handcuffs stopped her. I stared at the file on my kitchen table, the photo of a woman I'd never met, her small surgical scar circled in red marker like a target, and I felt a rage so cold it nearly broke me again. I found Grace through a transplant support group listed in Darlene's notes. She lived in Baltimore, worked as a physical therapist, and had donated her kidney to a 9-year-old girl named Chloe who was now thriving, anonymous, and safe despite everything. When I called her, she was bewildered, then horrified. She had never spoken to a reporter. She had never been contacted by my mother. But my mother had obtained her medical timeline, her surgeon's name, and a photograph of her at a donor appreciation event from a social media post she'd thought was private. The tabloid had been preparing a piece titled, "I Gave My Kidney to a Stranger and It Destroyed My Family." The narrative was fabricated, built from social media scraps and the same stale formula of manufactured tragedy. Grace cried when I told her the truth. Then she asked the same question I'd been asking for weeks: how do we stop this from happening again? The answer came faster than either of us expected. Elaine, my attorney, connected us with a class action firm specializing in privacy violations. Within 2 weeks, Grace and I filed a joint civil suit against Real Life Weekly, Inside Story Weekly, and our mother, Darlene, jointly, her for fraud, invasion of privacy, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and violation of state medical privacy laws. The suit named Colleen Bray and the hospital as well, though the hospital, to their credit, immediately settled and offered to fund independent privacy audits and new security training for all staff. The tabloids, faced with sworn testimony from their own editor about fabricated quotes and paid hospital leaks, folded. Real Life Weekly issued a public apology, fired Stuart Vance, and agreed to a settlement that included a substantial donation to an organ donor advocacy fund we were establishing. Inside Story Weekly killed the Grace article before it ever went to print. My mother's criminal trial took place 6 months later. She faced 7 felony counts: perjury, forgery, fraud, conspiracy to commit identity theft, and 3 counts of violating Maryland and Pennsylvania privacy statutes. I testified again. So did Grace. So did Ben, who told the jury about the custody battle, about the night he drove to my house holding a magazine and the weight of nearly losing his daughter. The prosecution played voicemails Darlene had left for Colleen, promising more good stuff as long as Colleen kept feeding her. The jury deliberated for 4 hours, guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced her to 7 years in state prison with an additional 5 years of supervised probation and a permanent injunction barring her from profiting off any story involving organ donation or any family member's medical history. As they let her out, she looked at me one last time. Her mouth was a thin line, but her eyes held a flicker of something I couldn't name. Not remorse, not anger, maybe the slow dawning that her whole life's strategy had failed. I didn't feel triumph. I felt the quiet exhaustion of someone who had finally closed a door that should have been locked decades ago. Colleen Bray was convicted separately of HIPAA violations and accepting bribes. She served 18 months. The hospital, after the investigation, discovered that my mother had targeted 2 other nurses before Colleen agreed, attempting to groom them through flattery and small gifts. Those nurses reported the contact, but the reports had never reached the legal team. That gap was closed. New policies mandated immediate escalation of any media inquiry about a donor or recipient, and all staff who handled transplant patient records now undergo annual privacy training with simulated social engineering tests. The transplant center created a donor privacy hotline, and Maureen was promoted to lead a new patient advocacy unit dedicated to protecting donors from external exploitation. She and I still talk. She told me once, quietly, that my case had become mandatory reading in medical ethics courses across the country. But the moment that truly changed everything came on a Sunday afternoon in October, the first meeting officially arranged between Ben, me, Maya, and Grace. The transplant center facilitated it now that anonymity was properly waived with mutual consent and legal safeguards. We met at a park near Ben's home in Western Maryland. Maya ran ahead, 7 years old, all pigtails and boundless energy, and when she saw me, she stopped, looked up at her father, and said, "Is that the lady who gave you the special kidney?" Ben nodded, tears already starting. Maya walked up to me, hugged my legs without hesitation, and said, "Thank you for saving my dad." I knelt down and told her that her dad saved himself by being brave enough to accept a gift from a stranger. I don't know if she understood, but she smiled the way kids do when they know the grown-ups are being real. Grace sat on a bench watching Chloe, her 9-year-old recipient, play on the swings. The parents of Chloe had joined us in the surreal beauty of that afternoon. 5 families bound by anonymous gifts and 1 woman's attempt to turn those gifts into profit hung in the air like something sacred. Ben handed me a letter that day, handwritten. He tried to send it through the transplant center years ago, but it had been delayed, lost in the administrative chaos following the breach. It was 4 pages long. He described his first morning after surgery, how he woke up without pain for the first time in years. He described Maya's face when he could finally lift her onto his shoulders without exhaustion. He described his own promise to live a life worthy of the gift, and then a passage that broke something loose in me. "You gave me years I wasn't supposed to have, and you did it without ever asking for my name. When I saw your photo in that terrible article, I realized that someone had tried to steal your gift to turn it into something ugly. I came to your house that night because I wanted you to know that the gift itself was still beautiful. No tabloid can take that." I folded the letter and held it against my chest. He was right. The scar on my abdomen was still there, still white, still fatting, but it had become something else, evidence not just of surgery, but of resilience. The story rippled outward in ways I didn't anticipate. Grace and I began speaking at medical conferences, sharing our experience to advocate for stronger donor protections. We met dozens of other living donors who had been approached by journalists, some ethically, many not. We learned that our situation, while extreme, was part of a larger pattern of media exploitation of transplant narratives, where the hunger for miracle reunion stories often steamrolled over privacy boundaries. With the support of the hospital's legal team, we helped draft a model state law called the Living Donor Privacy Protection Act, which makes it a criminal offense to publish identifying information about a living organ donor without their explicit written consent. The bill passed in Pennsylvania and Maryland within a year, and other states are now considering it. My mother's legacy, the thing she hoped would make her rich, ended up making it harder for anyone like her to profit again. I still teach biology. Javier, my former student who inspired the whole journey, came back to visit me after he graduated college. He's healthy, working as a social worker now. When I told him about everything, he said something I'll never forget. You donated a kidney because you saw me fighting to live, but the fight didn't end with the operation. You kept fighting for me, for Ben, for Grace, for everyone. That more than anything helped me reframe the entire experience. The donation was an act of love, the aftermath was an act of justice, both were necessary. But here's the final detail, the one I didn't see coming until much later. When the police returned my mother's seized belongings after the trial, I found a letter she had never sent stuffed in a pocket of her planner. It was addressed to me, dated the week before the article came out. In it, she wrote, "Linda, you think I'm doing this for money, but the truth is I just wanted to be part of something important. You gave away a kidney and never even told me. You shut me out." This story is the only way I could touch that part of your life. I read it 4 times. It wasn't an apology, it was an explanation, twisted and self-serving, but underneath it was something I recognized, the desperate need to be near something good without knowing how to be good yourself. I didn't forgive her, I may never forgive her, but I understood something that day that I hadn't before. My mother was a broken person who saw love as a transaction, celebration as exposure, connection as currency, and I had spent my whole life trying to hide the things I loved so she couldn't sell them. That strategy didn't work. The only thing that worked was refusing to hide anymore and building a life so full of genuine connection that her counterfeits couldn't hurt it. I still have the letter. I keep it in a drawer with the other things I'm not ready to throw away. Now, if you're watching this and wondering what happens to the people in this story, let me tell you quickly. Ben is a father with full custody and a thriving carpentry business. Maya is 10 in 5th grade and she wants to be a doctor. Grace runs a nonprofit that supports living donors through financial and legal resources. Colleen was released, moved out of state, and hasn't been in contact. The hospital's privacy protocols are now a model for transplant centers nationwide. Darlene is serving her sentence and will not be eligible for parole for another 3 years. She writes me sometimes. I read the letters, then put them in the drawer with the unsent one. I don't respond. Not yet, maybe one day. But there's one more thing, something that happened just last month that showed me how far the ripples of this story have gone, and I think you need to hear it. Last month, I received a letter from a woman I'd never met. Her name is Alina and she lives in Ohio. She wrote to tell me that her son, a 19-year-old named Marcus, needed a kidney. The family had been on the waiting list for 2 years. Alina had seen my story in a legitimate news piece that covered the Living Donor Privacy Protection Act, not the tabloid smear. She wrote, "I almost didn't reach out because of what your mother did to you. I was afraid any contact would feel like an invasion. But then I realized you fought so hard to keep the donation pure, and I thought maybe you would want to know that a real, honest connection can still come from this." She didn't ask for money. She didn't ask for an organ. She just wanted me to know that my story had taught a stranger how to approach a donor with respect. I called her, we talked for an hour. She told me about Marcus, his favorite books, his terrible jokes, the way he still played guitar even on dialysis days. She told me she started a local group for families navigating the transplant list, and they used my case as a discussion tool about boundaries and consent. At the end of the call, she said, "You made us all more careful, but you didn't make us afraid. That's a gift too." I hung up and sat with that. All the damage my mother caused, all the fear and exposure and courtroom chaos had somehow not made people afraid of connection. It had shown them exactly how to protect it. That was the ripple I didn't expect. My mother's scheme didn't just backfire legally, it backfired culturally. It became a blueprint for what not to do, and people like Alina used it to build safer, kinder networks for donors and recipients. I think about that often now when I see the scar in the mirror. It used to be a reminder of a secret I had to guard, then it became evidence in a trial. Now it's something else, a mark that says I trusted people enough to give, and when that trust was broken, I trusted myself enough to fight back. Not everyone gets that chance. Many living donors stay silent because exposure feels too dangerous. I hope that changes. I hope the laws we fought for and the conversations we started make it easier for people to give without fear of being turned into content. If this story resonated with you, if it made you think about the boundaries you keep or the ones you might need to build, let me know in the comments. What would you have done? Would you have opened that door? And if you're considering becoming a living donor, talk to a transplant center. Ask about their privacy protections. The walls around that gift matter as much as the gift itself. Before you go, please like and subscribe, but only if this story truly earned it from you. And there's another story linked below about a teacher whose quiet decision changed an entire community. I think you'll feel the same pull toward it that I felt the first time I heard it. Thank you for being here. I'll see you next time.